Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. The Minnesota Timberwolves made 4 trades during the NBA draft on Thursday night. They came away with 4 players and they also swapped a bunch of future picks. We'll break down all the moves. Also, how does Walker Kessler fit the Timberwolves? How does their other first round pick, Wendell Moore, fit the Timberwolves? Breaking down all of draft night. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy day after the NBA draft and happy weekend. Thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. I'm recording this pretty much immediately following the conclusion of the second round of Thursday night's draft, and I've done my best to organize my thoughts. There's a lot that happened on Thursday. Not as many established, players actually traded. I think like Kemba Walker was basically the only current NBA player traded, if I'm not mistaken. There were very few. Obviously, the Wolves didn't trade anybody on their current roster, but there were a lot of draft pick trades. The Wolves were part of 4 trades just themselves. And so I try to kind of parse all this, going to give my overall thoughts on what went down, what exactly happened. And then I also want to talk about what can we learn from what they did tonight based on, or what's a better way of saying that? What's the offseason strategy for the Wolves moving forward? What can we glean from Thursday night's draft to give us some, tip the hand a little bit of Tim Connelly and the Timberwolves front office for the rest of this offseason? So we're going to do all that here on the show. First, let's talk about what the Timberwolves actually did. So the Wolves came into the draft, of course, with pick number 19 in the first round. They had 40, 48, and 50 in the second round. They only actually picked at one of those 5 selections coming into the draft. They drafted Walker Kessler, the 7'1" center out of Auburn, at 22 after trading the number 19 pick for 22 and 29. Then they took 29 and 2 future second round picks to trade back up from 29 to 26. They took Wendell Moore Jr. out of Duke, a wing from Duke. The Timberwolves then traded the 40th pick for number 45 and a future second round pick and drafted Josh Minott out of Memphis at 45. The Wolves then traded 48 for a future second round pick and then stood pat at 50 and took Matteo Spagnolo, a likely draft and stash guard, an Italian guard at number 50 in the draft, which was the only one of the 5 picks that had coming into the draft that they actually drafted at. So they did end up selecting 4 players, which was, my prediction coming in was that they would probably end up with 2 selections, total that would be on the roster this year, 1 draft and stash and 1 trade. Well, they actually picked up an extra pick along the way. So they actually drafted 4 players, one of whom is a draft and stash, but 3 that likely will be on the roster in some form or fashion this year. Certainly in the case of Kessler and Moore, and Meinet, possibly a 2-way. We'll talk more about him later. So let's start with the value of what they did, right? So overall, what the Wolves did is they traded out numbers 19, pick 40, pick 48, and 3 future second rounders, plus the 29th pick that they acquired over the course of the night. They got back the 22nd pick, the 26th pick, 45, and 2 future second rounders. So if you look at sheer value, you put together a draft chart like they do with the NFL draft chart, where like one pick is assigned a certain value and another pick, other picks are assigned another value. So you can line everything up on that chart. Traditionally, you can tell whether or not something was good value or a good trade for both sides. And in that regard, I don't know that the Wolves got great value, right? They moved back in the first round, but they did pick up an additional first rounder. They also ended up net -1 second rounder for the future. Or I guess if you want to include this year, net -2 second rounders, because they traded out 2 from this year and 3 future. They got back 1 this year and 2 future. So -2 second round picks overall for the Wolves. And they ended up picking up an extra first rounder, but again, traded back from 19. So if you look at that, it's maybe a little disappointing, but obviously that's just one very narrow way of looking at this. I think we need to break down each prospect individually and also talk about what the fit is with Minnesota. And obviously it's too early to really know any of this stuff, right? So what I want to do is kind of go with each player, talk a little bit about each player here. I did do live shows, so if you want to hear my immediate reaction following the Kessler pick, and then I also did one I scrambled to do it after the Moore pick after the Wolves traded back up from 29. Those are on YouTube only. So go over to the Lockdown Wolves YouTube channel. You can subscribe there. You can find those shows that I did live about Kessler and Moore on the night of the draft. I did not do live shows for the second round, so I do want to give some thoughts on those guys here in a minute. So that'll be the show here today. And we'll spend a little bit more time on each of these guys and also the philosophy overall next week. Hope to have on at least one of the lockdown draft experts to break down some of these guys, especially, the first round picks are first round picks, right? So everybody wants to know how are they going to fit in this rotation. But the second round guys, I didn't talk about Meinet or Spagnolo at all on this podcast leading into the draft. We need to learn more about these guys and from somebody who's actually a draft expert to kind of discern what they are in terms of their profiles of prospect, what their upside could be for the Wolves, and what they could potentially provide early on in their respective NBA careers. So we're gonna do all that here on the show. Next, what I want to do is I want to start with the Kessler conversation and kind of weave in the conversation of overarching for the night. What did the Wolves do and what did they not do that could potentially tip their hand for the rest of this offseason? So we're going to do that here next. First, let's talk about our friends over at Arcade One Up. Boom shakalaka. We have big news. The one, the only NBA Jam is back. Arcade One Up, the leader in at-home retro arcade games, is not only bringing the best game ever back, but they've made it bigger than ever with wait for it, a Shaq Edition machine. People are obsessed with NBA Jam, and I'm thrilled to tell our listeners that you can once again play hoops with NBA legends in this arcade classic. Jump clear across the court and set the ball on fire in one of the first sports games ever to feature real and digitized NBA licensed teams. No fouls, no free throws, and of course, no quarters required. Compete with friends and family through all new Wi-Fi leaderboards, making you more connected than ever. Pre-order now from arcade1up.com. That's arcade, the number one, up.com for an estimated early September ship date. Arcade One Up is the place for fun. They've got even more classics like Golden Tee, Mortal Kombat, and many others starting at just $3.99. And check this out. They're giving away an NBA Jam Shaq Edition to a Locked On listener. Enter for a chance to win a game console for your man cave at arcade1up.com/lockedon. Again, that's arcade, the number one, up.com/lockedon. You've got till July 8th to enter to win an NBA Jam Shaq Edition console. Don't miss out. Enter today. All right, let's have this Walker Kessler conversation. So I talked about him on the show, I think last week, maybe Monday of this week, actually. I don't know. The draft prep process was a bit of a blur over the past couple of weeks. Kessler's a legit 7'1" center, right? He's a 5. He's nothing else. He didn't shoot the ball outside of 2 feet very often at all. I mean, he made a couple of threes, but he's a 5, right? I maintained throughout the draft process, throughout the prep process, that the Timberwolves should not be drafting a 5 in this draft. I didn't think Mark Williams was a fit if he somehow fell to 19, the Duke big that went, a few picks before the Wolves. I didn't love Kessler as a prospect. I ended up having him, I think, 21 on my board, maybe, and I guess they got him at 22. So based on my board, Kessler was okay value. But it all comes down to whether or not you think the Wolves can or should be playing big with Karl-Anthony Towns at the 4 in the upcoming season and beyond. Obviously, Chris Finch and Tim Connelly and the Timberwolves front office and coaching staff believe that they can and should play play big moving forward. We know that Chris Finch likes to play big in general, right? Remember, Ryan Saunders was using Josh Okogie at the 4, Jake Layman at the 4, and we saw Chris Finch immediately when he took over the team. Juancho Hernan-Gomez was playing the 3 last year at times. He was exclusively a 4 under Ryan Saunders. We saw Jared Vanderbilt briefly play some 3. We saw Naz Reid and Karl-Anthony Towns play some limited minutes together, which we basically never saw under Ryan Saunders. So the intention for playing bigger, and also Jaden McDaniels playing more 3 than 4. Finch wants to play big. Clearly, that's what Connelly wants to do as well. We saw a lot of teams have success in this year's playoffs with bigger lineups. The question is, what do you do in the playoffs, especially when an opposing team tries to put your weaker perimeter defenders in pick and roll game? How do you defend that? Um, One of the things the Wolves struggled with mightily this year was they had a ton of success early in the season, especially with high wall pick and roll coverage, right? Getting out on the perimeter, essentially blitzing the pick and roll, sometimes being a little less aggressive and simply playing the big at the level of the screen versus, in the past, the Wolves played a ton of drop coverage, and Karl-Anthony Towns was not a good drop coverage center. They tried to mix it in a little the latter part of this season. It was not successful. Towns gets into more foul trouble when he's playing drop because he's always reaching and swiping at the ball and backpedaling on his heels. And opposing teams would send their athletes downhill at Karl-Anthony Towns, knowing they could pick up a cheap foul or two or three or four on Towns, and drop coverage was not the Timberwolves' friend. However, there's certain matchups and certain situations where you have to be able to play drop coverage. Walker Kessler is a very good drop coverage defender. That was his bread and butter at Auburn from a defensive perspective, and he swatted shots on primary ball handlers. He just gobbled shots up for breakfast is what he was doing as a drop coverage pick and roll big. He has length that you simply can't teach. 7'5" wingspan. He clearly knows how to use his length. He's very good with angles, understanding how to funnel ball handlers to a tough spot, on the baseline, pin them essentially down low where then he can pin their shots up against the glass. And a very good feel, I guess, good instincts defensively. And the insane 19% block rate. I talked about this on the live show extensively, but it was like the second best block rate in the last couple decades in college basketball. Just phenomenal. And the idea is that the Wolves could play him and drop as the backup center. So you take Towns off the floor. Kessler is in the game. You can play drop coverage, or potentially you could play him with Towns. You could still play high wall coverage. Kessler's mobile enough. I believe he's mobile enough to play high wall, to play blitz pick and roll coverage. I don't think you're going to switch with him very much at the NBA level. It's not like Auburn did much of that anyway. I don't think he's going to be super switchable. I'd have concerns with lateral quickness at that point, but he's mobile enough to get to the perimeter to play high wall coverage on the perimeter. And that matters because if Kessler can do two of these things, if he can play high wall and he can play drop, and Towns can play high wall and can be a little bit switchable, now you've got a couple of combinations there. Both of your centers. Naz Reid's not really great at any of those things. He had a decent block rate. He has flashes as an offensive rebounder, but Naz is not a very good defensive rebounder. He's not very switchable. He's not comfortable in drop, although generally he actually plays drop better than Towns. Kessler replaces Naz Reid. You at least have two bigs in Kessler and Towns that could each play two of three coverages. So opposing offenses can't entirely expect one coverage all the time. You have a little more flexibility. And of course, we think that Finch and then we think that Connelly wants to play Towns and Kessler together at times, which is feasible. I don't know how sustainable it is. I tend to lean more towards this isn't going to work all the time camp, right? Which I guess is true of almost any lineup in basketball, right? You have to be able to adjust. That's the whole reason you have a bench. You can play matchups, et cetera. It's why you have coaches. I just worry about defensively, especially in regards to if they're both on the floor and you're what coverage are you going to play? Are you only going to play high wall? Is Kessler able to keep him back and guard the rim, guard the paint? Is Towns going to get pulled into ball screen action? Is the opposing offense going to dictate who's in which spot on the floor and try and get the switches that they want? How are the Wolves going to handle that? Remember, Memphis did a phenomenal job of dictating the terms of who was guarding who in the playoff series. And then offensively, is Kessler simply going to play a similar role as, say, Jared Vanderbilt and play in the dunker spot? He could, but Kessler's actually a good screener and a fantastic short roll big, meaning that he can set a screen and short roll. He can essentially pause or, stop, get the pass around the free throw line. And from there, it's one dribble, two strides, and a dunk, maybe not even a dribble, or it's a pass to a baseline cutter, somebody in the dunker spot, a dump off pass to a cutter that's under the basket. There's a variety of things that Kessler can do in that situation. And he had the basketball instincts and awareness to do that. Or basketball IQ and awareness and overall just general feel and instincts to be really good in pick and roll games. So that's the offensive upside for Kessler, or at least what he could do from day one. There is some shooting upside. He has good touch around the rim. He shot the ball a little bit in high school. Apparently, I haven't watched tape of Walker Kessler in high school, but apparently he shot the ball more from the perimeter there and can do it. I mean, there is footage of him making threes at Auburn, just not very many. He was a 20% shooter on jump shots, 20% from three. He didn't exactly shoot the ball in the mid range. Not a good jump shooter, but there apparently is some of that in him. Maybe eventually they tap into that. But I think the idea now, from my perspective, is he's playing however many minutes a game. Hopefully it's only 16 or so minutes a game as Towns' primary backup. Maybe you're playing 4 to 8 minutes a game with him next to Towns, depending on matchups, depending on foul trouble for both players. And you could try your twin towers, your modern day twin towers, if you will. I should mention Kessler's not just like a stiff with the ball in his hands either. Even though he's not a perimeter jump shooter, he's a pretty good passer. I mentioned his ability in the short roll as a short roll big, but he can also pass the ball a little bit in the open floor on the perimeter if he ends up with the ball in his hands. He can handle the ball a little bit. He can dribble for a guy who's 7'1" with a 7'5" wingspan. He's not Chet Holmgren. He's not going to create his own shot necessarily, but he's fluid enough with the ball in his hands that it's not super uncomfortable if he ends up with the ball somewhere that's, not simply a lob pass. So that's good too, because it implies you could play him with Towns. You could kind of invert those roles a little bit. Not that you want Kessler handling on the perimeter all the time, but you could play Towns in the low post and have Kessler somewhere in the high post, mid post, and do something there with the high low action with bigs, both good passers, both good, have good touch around the rim, both good roll men. So I'm sure that there's some thought there. And remember, not at all saying that this is what this duo is, but Chris Finch was in New Orleans when they had Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins. Walker Kessler's not either one of those guys, and they're both different players from Karl-Anthony Towns in some regard, but playing multiple bigs together is something that Finch has liked to do in the past. And Connelly was actually in New Orleans too, I guess a little bit before that, before he went to Denver. But there's, Connelly was in New Orleans with Dell Demps, who's now also in the Timberwolves front office. So all those guys have a history of playing multiple bigs together, multiple 7-footers together. So I do think that plays into this, quite frankly. Okay. Let's talk about what this means in terms of the Timberwolves' overall approach. Or actually, let's do that last. Let's get to Wendell Moore next. So let's talk about Wendell Moore Jr., and then we'll talk briefly about second rounders, and then we'll talk about the overarching, what this means for this draft, or what this means potentially for the offseason. So let's talk about Wendell Moore. Wendell Moore Jr. is a guy who I thought was going to be more of a high second round type pick, more of a low upside type guy. He's really kind of a two-way role player, if you will, if that makes sense. He's not. I don't know that I would call him a true 3-and-D player, because I think the 3-point percentage or 3-point sample is small enough. But he's a very good defender. Was fantastic defending the pick and roll ball handler. I should say, out of Duke, 6'5", 7-foot wingspan. Should be able to guard at least 3 positions at the NBA level. Fantastic guarding in the pick and roll, guarding the ball handler. Really good instincts, can poke the ball away, could get wrap around, essentially reaching around the offensive player to grab steals from behind. The build and the activity defensively reminds me a little bit of Josh Okogie, but a little bit bigger with thicker build at this stage in his career. And offensively, he does have something of a jumper. He shot 41% from 3 on relatively small volume this year. Not small volume, modest volume, around 3 attempts per game. 52% on catch and shoot 3-point opportunities. Now, as a sophomore, as a freshman, those 3-point percentages are much more ugly. For his career, he's only about 36%. So a big jump in his junior year at Duke. Hopefully that wasn't a fluke. And hopefully this is the form isn't perfect. Certainly the mechanics on the shot. But if it's real and he's legit going to be a high 30s 3-point shooter at the NBA level and can play lockdown defense, guard a ball handler, be switchable, be versatile, and this is a really nice pick. The way I put it on the live shows earlier, and then also I joined Locked On Minnesota, Locked On Sports Minnesota, the Ron Johnson show, which you can find right now over at their feed, the Locked On Sports Minnesota Ron Johnson show. You can find it on YouTube. I talked a little bit about the Wolves looking for higher floor, modest ceiling. I wouldn't say low ceiling, but high floor type guys. Kessler's, a little bit younger than Moore, but both guys who have, we kind of know what the worst case is, right? They're both going to be rotation guys at the NBA level. I mean, Kessler's a good enough shot blocker that he's going to carve out a role, even if it's as a backup five, and you can never ever actually play him with Towns. If something happens where that's not feasible, he's still going to have a floor that's a rotation guy in the NBA. I think that's very likely for Wendell Moore Jr. too. He's a good enough defender and a good enough shooter, not super athletic, which limits his ceiling, right? And he's not going to create for himself off the bounce at the NBA level because of the relative lack of athleticism. But the size, the 7-foot wingspan, the defensive ability, the catch and shoot ability from the perimeter, he's a high floor, modest ceiling kind of guy. That's what the Wolves have did with their first two picks in this draft. And I want to talk a little bit about that more next. And then I'll touch briefly on the 2 second-round picks. We've got a ton to talk about next week. 4 draft picks, tons of time to break this down all next week. But I do want to touch on all that stuff here next before we close the show for today. First, let's talk about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. Plus, BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news throughout all seasons. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Okay, let's talk about second rounders and then the overarching, takeaway from this year's draft for the Wolves. The Timberwolves did trade the number 40 selection. They traded back. They picked up 45 and a future second. And at 45, the Timberwolves selected Josh Minott, who I think probably a lot of people had him a little bit higher than this. And I think it's clearly because of the upside for Meinet. Meinett's 6'8" with a 6'11" wingspan, one of the best athletes in this draft, bar none. Athleticism is off the charts. There's some people that because of this, the size and the athleticism, and some of the stuff I'll get to in a minute, may have even had him as a late first rounder because of the upside. And really, that's the steal and the block rates, which is a great indicator of awareness, of athleticism, of understanding of spacing, defensive roles, etc. at the college level. The steal and block rates are fantastic for a 6'8" athlete with 6'11" wingspan. He plays passing lanes extremely well, good instincts at Memphis. He wasn't a major piece of their rotation, only started a handful of games, and the per game numbers are not impressive, extremely raw. But if you put on a highlight of Josh Minott, he's dunking all over people in the for Memphis last year. Any opportunity he had, he was dunking all over people, and that is undeniable. The athleticism, the ability in the open floor, the transition ability, and I also think it's underscores with the steal and block rates because he's all over the floor. The help defense is there. A lot of times with athletes, and I'm generalizing here, but you get these athletes in the second round, and you're hoping that a couple different things can click. But it seems like the basketball IQ, if you will, the instincts are there, at least as an off-ball defender. On-ball defender, came and went a little bit. There were some lapses, but there were flashes of being a phenomenal on-ball defender, and theoretically, he could guard 1 through 5. Off-ball, he was phenomenal. The steal rate, the block rate, playing passing lanes, fantastic instincts, the high motor to get through screens, to get chase down blocks in the open floor, to act as a free safety and intercept, skip pass, a cross-court pass. It's the combination of his high motor and athleticism is exactly what the Wolves needed to add, to the fringes of this roster. Also, the rebounding. He's 6'8". He's probably a 3 or a 4. I guess with what the Wolves want to do, more like a 4 at the NBA level. But rebounding is one of the areas the Wolves needed to get better. And I've talked about it plenty in this podcast. You can't simply get better at rebounding by drafting more centers and more size because your best player is a 7-footer, right? So what do the Wolves need to do? They need to improve their rebounding. They need to improve their rebounding from other positions, their size, their shot blocking ability at other positions on the floor. They need better rebounding wings and guards. They need, wings that can block shots from their position in the open floor, help down, be the low man in the Timberwolves half court defensive coverage and help at least, put up a fight at the rim. Jaden McDaniels has gotten much better at that. He's one example. Jared Vanderbilt can do those things a little bit. He's a good rebounder for his size. Josh Minott actually reminds me a little bit of Jared Vanderbilt, a little bit smaller. He's 6'8", Vando's 6'9"-ish. Minus 6'11" wings, Vando's 7-ish, so maybe an inch shorter on each. So he's more of like a wing version of Jared Vanderbilt in some ways, but the high motor, the rebounding upside, the athleticism, he's more athletic than Vando. I think he's got better hands. He actually was pretty good as the roll man when he was in pick and roll in Memphis's offense this last year. I think he's a higher upside version of Jared Vanderbilt. He will not have a rotation role for the Timberwolves this year. Very likely he's a two-way type guy. They could sign him to a two-way contract, or he just straight is in the G League this year. But I see him, Vando's got a couple years left on that deal he just signed. Maybe in 2 years when Vando's price goes up again, maybe Meinet assumes that role. And perhaps at that time, maybe it's a bench role, maybe it's still a starting four. But Meinet is the type of guy who's got that. Frankly, I think he has star caliber upside. I don't think he'll be a star. That's certainly not the most likely outcome. But at the very least, I think it's fair to say that his upside is probably starter level, right? He doesn't have a jumper, neither does Vando. It's very hard to be a star with literally no jumper, but if they can rebuild his form and he's got, again, the instincts, the IQ, all the other tools are there. And he's a little loose with the handle. He's not going to be creating for anybody else. But all the tools are there. All the tools are there. He apparently shined in draft workouts, which we hear that about a lot of guys, and I take that with many grains of salt every year, but looked really good against first-round type picks in draft workouts for the Wolves and for other teams. I really like this pick because it is a swing. And while the floor is probably he's not an NBA player, it's also a second-round pick, so there's really no risk here. And I think the most likely outcome is he's a Vando type of player, activity, rebounding, defense, all those things, all things that the Wolves still need, and I really like the pick. Briefly, Mateo Spagnolo is a 6'5" guard. He was drafted with the 50th pick. The Wolves traded the 48th pick for a future second-round selection. Spagnolo was picked at number 50, which is right around where a lot of people had him on their big boards and mock drafts. 6'5" with a 6'8" wingspan, a big guard out of Italy. He's only 19 years old. He almost certainly will play a year. And actually, Tim Connelly said this after the draft in his press conference that he's expected to play a year overseas, at least a year, if not two, before he comes over. So 6'5" with a 6'8" wingspan, can create his own shot. He's a very good shooter. He mostly shot the ball off the dribble, not catch and shoot situations. He had a limited number of catch and shoot opportunities. He's not a point guard. He's much more of a two guard. I think he could be a good secondary playmaker, from the admittedly brief number of clips that I've seen of him. And there's actually a really good article over at Peachtree Hoops, I think it is, where they broke down his game a bit further. And very specific, like cut-ups, essentially, of different things that he can do. I think he's very likely going to be a wing at the NBA level, kind of a 2-3. I think he's got strong upside. He may still be growing. I do think he's a solid defender right now. There were some issues with lapses, but again, 19 years old. He's not a great athlete, but if the athleticism's enough, and the instincts are there, and the size, again, 6'5" with a 6'8" wingspan is there, I think he could be a solid NBA defender. The real upside for him is, can he continue to create his own shot at the NBA level? Can he get off his jumper against NBA caliber defenders? I think with coaching and a continually improving jumper, he was over 40% from three this year at a relatively small volume. But the range continues to improve. He's shooting the ball from deeper and deeper, and again, over 40% from three. If the jumper continues to improve and he gets coached up and the athleticism is just enough, I think he's a nice rotation piece at the NBA level here in a couple of years. Could even be a primary scorer, secondary creator type off the bench, a combo guard type player. So I like the pick. Again, there's really no downside here. Obviously, Tim Connelly has a well-documented track record of success in the second round of the NBA draft. So Spagnolo is certainly a fascinating pick. I want to hit briefly, very, very briefly here at the end of the show, on a theme that I want to expand on next week, and that is, what can we take from this year's draft that could hint at what the Wolves may be considering doing over the course of the rest of the offseason? The Wolves drafted almost everything. They drafted size in Walker Kessler. They drafted wings in Wendell Moore, to a lesser extent, Josh Minott. They drafted a draft and stash guy with a little bit of a higher upside in Spagnolo. So they drafted their wings. They drafted some shooting with Moore. They drafted some, rim protection in Kessler, size, obviously. What did they not draft? They did not draft a lead guard. They did not draft a point guard. And I've talked about on the show, I never thought the Wolves were in on Ty Washington. I didn't think they were necessarily going to take the guard from Tennessee. I think there were some of the stuff was overblown because the national media kind of looks at it and says, oh, well, the Wolves are trading D'Lo potentially at some point. So of course they're going to draft a guard. No, that doesn't make sense. If you trade D'Lo and you replace him with, say, it's Ty Washington, is Ty Washington going to be good as a rookie as D'Angelo Russell was last year? No. There's like almost a 0% chance that happens, right? D'Lo might be overpaid. He may end up being traded. They may be better moving him and getting back other pieces. I get all that, and I've talked about it extensively, but he's still a good player. He's still better than a rookie version of Ty Washington, who's going to have his own issues adjusting to the NBA, lack of athleticism. Actually, some of the same issues D'Lo has, except for he's a rookie that would be coming into this situation. Running the show with Anthony Edwards, Karl-Anthony Towns, Jaden McDaniels, would he be better than D'Lo? No. The answer is no. And if you want to go from the 7 seed to a 5 seed or a 4 seed this year, you can't do that. I know Tyrese Maxey was great for the Sixers very quickly. That's the exception. It's not the rule. So I don't think this means they're not trading D'Lo, but I think it's an indicator that they're very comfortable with D'Lo still being on the roster. And I've said that on the show extensively as well. I talked about this on Locked On Sports Minnesota on the Ron Johnson show on Friday as well. The Wolves are comfortable with D'Lo on the roster. They were good with him. They won 46 games with him last year. He's got chemistry and synergy with Karl-Anthony Towns and even with Ant to a lesser extent, but there's certainly a comfort level there as well. The Wolves are not up against a wall having to trade D'Angelo Russell. They've still got him for another year. He's not going to lose trade value necessarily. They could run it back. They could win 50 games and then let him walk in the offseason. And no, you're not getting anything. But if you win 50 games and you gain the cap space, then fine. I mean, it's better than trading him for pennies on the dollar now. So I don't think they're necessarily for sure trading D'Angelo Russell. I just think it's notable the lack of backcourt guys that the Wolves drafted in this. The only guy they got that you would say is a 2 would be the drafting stash, Matteo Spagnolo, who's not going to come over for at least a year. So not additional backcourt additions at this point. Obviously, the Wolves are going to look to free agency, the mid-level exception. They've got a couple roster spots still. They probably will sign a guard. But the D'Lo thing is, I think, a little blown out of proportion for a media scene that really wants there to be some movement. I've said all along, I think the Wolves do less this offseason than many people think they will. They've got their stars, right? They're looking for for ancillary players. D'Lo basically is that right now. It's just he's paid on a max contract, but he is not the focal point of what the Wolves are trying to do. So as long as the Wolves think he can accept something of that role and be that complementary player, at times the straw that stirs the drink, at times he's playing off the ball, he's a spot up shooter, he's doing damage in transition as a facilitator, as a stop and pop, pull up shooter from the perimeter. If he can accept that role and do a good job this year, they could win 50 games with D'Angelo Russell and let him walk in the offseason. If they're worried about the fit, et cetera, they could trade him and get less back than he's probably worth. That's also an option. They don't have to make that decision right now. And this draft, I think on Thursday, that came through, right? Tim Connelly did not feel pressured into making that decision on the spot on Thursday night. Sitting here now, my bet is still that D'Angelo Russell's on this roster opening night. Been saying that all along. Could absolutely be wrong. I mean, they could trade him at any moment if the right offer comes along. I don't think the Pacers want him, but hey, Miles Turner could be available. The Wizards drafted a guard in Johnny Davis. He's not really a point guard, so they may still be looking for a point guard. There's always the Clippers. There's always the Knicks. There's teams that are still out there looking for guards. D'Lo still very well could be traded in the next week or so leading into free agency. I still think the most likely scenario is he's on the roster on opening night. But obviously we'll keep tabs on that. Next week, we're going to break down each of these picks a little bit more in depth, spend probably most of an entire show on certainly the 3 guys that are likely to be on the roster in Kessler, Moore, and Meinet. And then we'll also have at least one of the Locked On NBA draft experts on the show next week as well to help break down these prospects. So plenty to talk about. If anything were to break over the weekend, we'll, of course, get you covered here at Locked On Wolves. But otherwise, we'll be back on Monday to talk more draft and start prepping for free agency. We're just a week away now from NBA free agency. So we're going to do all that next week. Thank you so much for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Shows on YouTube. If you missed them, go back and watch my live reaction. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere on all of your favorite audio platforms as well, from Apple to Google, Spotify to Odyssey. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.